Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan, and I hope you guys had a really Merry Christmas. So, I watched a movie the other day called Rebel Moon. It's a film that in many ways is inspired by Star Wars, but due to a variety of different reasons, it was developed independently of Disney and Lucasfilm. Upon finishing the movie and thoroughly enjoying it and reading critic and audience reviews, I came to a realization that the reaction to this film in a lot of ways helps us assess the current state of the Star Wars franchise and understand the great hurdles that Lucasfilm and Disney face going forward, making movies for Star Wars. So let me start this video by talking about how I found out about Rebel Moon in the first place. The other day I was in the city and I was walking past the iconic Paris Theater, an art house movie theater that first opened its doors in 1948 in the optimistic post-war period in New York City. It was during this time that some of the greatest minds in America's cinema were beginning to plan their own careers and future projects. A young George Lucas most likely sat in an art theater just like this, watching Akira Kurosawa films like Hidden Fortress and finding inspiration for Star Wars. Now, what separates the Paris Theater from the megaplexes that we're used to nowadays is that it only had one screen, one theater. And not just any theater, but a massive, spectacular 535-seat room filled with far too much gold trim and rows upon rows of crimson upholstered seats, and of course the obligatory red carpet covering every inch of floor space. The Paris Theater was built at the tail end of the golden age of Hollywood, and it represents an era where there were less entertainment options, when movies had a certain status and glimmer to them. Back then, the only time you could see a film was in the theaters. There were no VCRs or DVDs or streaming services. When the first Star Wars film came out, people would just go to the theater again and again, which is not surprising considering how realistic the CGI must have looked back then. I know this because we're lucky enough to have some OG Star Wars fans on this channel. They often tell me how they saw the original film like 12 times. Just imagine being there at the premiere. It must have been mind-blowing, especially considering how realistic the spaceship combat looked and how cool the aliens were. Back then, going to the movies was really special. It was like an adventure. You actually had to leave your house. You entered these large rooms filled with comfy seats, air conditioning. It was almost like going to church, but for cinema. And unlike watching TV or listening to your favorite radio show at home, you actually had to pay for entrance, like going to the theater or a Broadway show. In 1977, when the first Star Wars film came out, the average movie ticket cost around $2.23, just a few cents short of the federal minimum wage at the time. Adjust for inflation, and that's around $10,862.31 in today's money. I'm just joking, it's like $11.65. Point being, while it wasn't something that only the upper class could afford, it was still costly enough that most people saw maybe a movie once or twice a month, not every day of the week, which is completely possible, especially now that we can watch movies not only on our TVs at home, but anywhere we take our smartphones, which definitely makes the experience a lot less special. And, that has to do a lot with audience demand. We wanted to see more movies about a variety of different subjects, and the movie industry just grew and expanded. Technologies like the ones developed by George Lucas while making Star Wars would make filmmaking more exciting and allow creators to bring more and more fantastic images to the screen for cheaper costs. We also would see the rise of the multiplex right as Star Wars hits. More screens meant the increased demand driven by the economic boom and deregulation of the 1980s, allowing for more movies to be made, including many films inspired by Star Wars. You had Alien and Aliens from Ridley Scott and James Cameron, and eventually the excellent Firefly series. Soon you had directors and creators who grew up watching Star Wars as kids and were actual fans who now wanted to make their own addition to this galaxy far, far away. One of those young kids who grew up watching Star Wars was director Zack Snyder. He's known for his intense and stylistic visuals, gritty and dark interpretations of the human story. You might have seen 300, Sin City, or Watchmen, and more recently he's had quite a controversial stretch with DC. But superhero drama aside, Zack Snyder is definitely an auteur, whether you like him or not, with a very unique style and vision. And he's wanted to make a Star Wars film for quite some time, and he actually pitches a project to Lucasfilm right as it gets acquired by Disney. Snyder probably saw this transitional period as a good opportunity to get in and continue telling the Star Wars saga now that George Lucas was no longer a part of the franchise. But Disney has always been very careful on how it chooses who develops its projects. And Zack's vision of a gritty Star Wars didn't really make the cut Disney is a family-friendly company. And so instead they would go in another direction with the sequel trilogy, an arguably safer direction that aimed to please everyone and unfortunately did the opposite. I'm not saying that Zack Snyder would have done a better job necessarily, but this is really the problem with, I guess, large corporations that are publicly traded that have huge amounts of investment in all of their artistic works. The more money involved in anything, the more cautious one has to be, and art is really not a realm where one should be cautious. Artists are weirdos that push the boundaries of human expression. They're the kids that everyone makes fun of at school, but ultimately their uniqueness and out-of-box thinking, their sensitivities and abstractions are necessary at pushing the art form forward. Normies aren't really that good at creating, they just consume. You need the eccentric artists. But again, as projects grow larger in size, you get more and more money people, financial people involved in the creative process. And that's because the very path that these people took to become chief financial officers and executives was one lined with rules and proper etiquette and attire. How can people who suppress their childhood curiosities and emotions, who trade in their individuality for a, corporate style personality, be trusted to create art? I mean, these are individuals who are concerned with the money side of the business, and they are a necessary evil. I mean, someone has to make sure that the artists don't OD or drink away the budget for the movie and, keep everything on track. But when there's too many of these guys around, usually the project really suffers and the artistic vision gets diluted. Snyder would eventually bring a Star Wars project to life as a separate IP. His wife even told him it was a blessing to leave Disney. If Zack Snyder thought working with Warner Brothers was restrictive, imagine having to deal with the Disney execs' heavy-handed, authoritarian, top-down approach. Interestingly enough, the only time Disney lets an auteur do his thing is with Tony Gilroy, and Andor is, in my opinion, the best Star Wars content ever created. Seriously. So first, Snyder would shop his movie idea with Warner Brothers, and eventually he would find a home for his film Rebel Moon with Netflix. And so the other day, while walking in the city, that's what I saw being advertised in the awning over the Paris Theater in New York. Actually, the venue had closed down in 2019, ending its reign as the sole surviving single-screen cinema in the city. And in that same year, Netflix bought the theater so that it could air its own movies and get them into the award shows. In a lot of ways, the transition and fate of the Paris Theater mirrors the transition of the cinema industry. Rebel Moon is an interesting film. My quick take is, if you like space operas with a bunch of fantasy elements and a lot of camp, you'll probably be able to digest this film quite well. If you're a fan of Zack Snyder's visuals, well, you'll really see his artistic flair shine better than ever because this is a space-themed movie, and the wide variety of planets that you visit really lends to this style. Now that I think about it, that extremely high contrast visual style he first started figuring out with Sin City and 300 was actually quite weird, especially for a retelling of a historical event. Now, a lot of critics did not like Rebel Moon. They point out that the movie features quite a lot of derivative and stereotypical story elements and characters. The story revolves around an assassination that has derailed the bloodline of a line of kings that stretch back for 1,000 generations. This Imperium controls the galaxy from the planet known as the Motherworld. We're not told who the assassin is, but if you watch enough films in the genre, you're going to assume it's that advisor, senator, or general who's hungrily eyed the throne for all these years. The main character is a child whose world and family was torn apart by the Empire. She'd be adopted by the very man who brought so much pain to her, and he would actually turn her into a killing machine. She would fight and kill for the Empire until something changes her heart. In true Seven Samurai form, Zack Snyder is also inspired by Akira Kurosawa. Our hero ends up on an idyllic-looking agrarian world, which is threatened by the Imperium. This is a planet full of peaceful farmers who toil in the fields all day and return to their Viking longhouses at night and drink ale and fornicate for the gods. But because it's Zack Snyder and he has no chill, this idyllic village also has a massive waterfall and mountain right above it, making it look more like Odin's meat hall in Valhalla than just a normal tiny little village. Yeah, it's derivative, but yeah, Vikings are cool and space Vikings are even better. This world also has a Tatooine vibe to it, right before the Empire stumbles upon the planet. Our heroine even gets her own twin sun moment as she stares off into the distance like Luke Skywalker. But again, because Zack Snyder has no chill here, it seems like the planet they're on is actually a moon, the Rebel Moon, of course, orbiting a gas giant, and this celestial body takes up the entire screen. Did I tell you this movie looks absolutely amazing? And, if you're into visuals, you should definitely just see it for that one reason. And ignore all those snotty elitist critics who say, great CGI and imagery doesn't matter if the story sucks. I mean, gatekeeping like that is so cringy. It's the 2020s right now. There's so much content out there for so many different niche interests. To not understand that and to think that there is an objective truth when looking at art is idiotic. Don't ever let a critic sway your first impression of art or decide for you what is important when consuming content. Most critics are really not worth listening to. I mean, all they do as a job is pass judgment on others. Many of these people don't even create art themselves. They're there to provide a service for us to help guide us into what we want to watch or what we don't want to watch. And I recommend, if you do want to find a good critic, find someone who really has the same taste as you do, so you're not disappointed. But nowadays, there's so much ego and gatekeeping, and a lot of these critics attempt to take their own subjective truth and push it onto others as if it's an objective truth. There's no such thing as an objective truth in art. Some of the things that the critics say I do agree with. I would say that Rebel Moon is kind of a campy mess in some ways, but it's also gloriously entertaining, and also has your usual Zack Snyder pacing issues. This time around, he actually planned a director's cut before he, released the movie, and I'm pretty sure that's gonna be rated R, a lot more violent. It's gonna take 90 hours. It's not gonna take 90 hours, but it's gonna be longer. Now, say what you want about George Lucas and his skills as a director or lack of skill, he definitely understood pacing very well. And let's actually talk more about George Lucas, because I want to compare Star Wars to Rebel Moon. I think every director has its strengths and weaknesses, and for George Lucas, he's really just not good at writing dialogue. I mean, actually his dialogue is hit or miss. But what he's even worse at is directing actors, and this really comes to the forefront when he auteurs the prequel series. That trilogy is more George Lucas in some ways than Episode 5 and Episode 6, but George Lucas more than makes up for it because he is a master in developing new CGI techniques. He's a great businessman, and he also has a pretty good grip of cinematography, camera motion, lighting, and framing. But perhaps his biggest strength, and the biggest strength of the Star Wars franchise, has always been the world building. And Zack Snyder really nails the world building in Rebel Moon, in my opinion. You have some relatively cliche character types, like the exiled and disgraced general, who of course is played by Jimon Hansu. This casting is almost too perfect in my opinion, if that is a thing. Then you have the silent and deadly Asian swordsman who's lost her entire family, the smuggling scoundrel, a darker version of Star Wars' Han Solo, and the wild king who talks to animals and tames beasts. The worlds they come from, the stories that are teased about their past lives, are quite visually and from a lore point fascinating. Even the Imperium, which visually is more Warhammer 40k than Galactic Empire, is exciting. I especially like Anthony Hopkins' character, a robot known as Jimmy. He comes from a holy order of robots that have sworn allegiance to the king, but since his unfortunate death, they have laid their weapons down. I feel like they might be the Jedi of this universe, but then again, their name sounds completely ripped out of Warhammer 40k. They're known as the Mechanicus Militarum. And then the main character in the story, Atticus Noble, very not cliche name there for a baddie, looks like a commissar when in uniform and a white nationalist when out. Subtle, Snyder, very subtle. Yes, Rebel Moon is pretty derivative, but so is most art. You could say that Star Wars was very derivative when it came out, and I enjoyed both of these films. I love Space Vikings. I really like these Blood Axe warriors. They remind me a lot of those spray paint huffing war boys from Fury Road. I thought it was cool that they created a Korean swordsman instead of the more stereotypical samurai swordsman. She even wears a traditional Joseon period gat on her head. And of course, the Warhammer vibes are awesome. Really awesome. Until at least Henry Cavill's project gets launched. Rebel Moon is a fun and exciting movie. It's entertaining, and that's kind of one of the major reasons why people make films, right? But the critics really bombed the crap out of Rebel Moon. It received 23% fresh rating on Rotten Tomato, and top critics actually gave it just 8% fresh rating, with an average of 3.1 out of 10, which is kind of brutal. I mean, when Star Wars was released, it wasn't an instant hit either. There were definitely a lot of critics, but I feel like a lot of critics also understood it, like the late Roger Ebert. He's one of my favorite reviewers if I would have to choose one. He wrote, "Star Wars is a fairy tale, a fantasy, a legend, finding its roots in some of our most popular fictions. It taps the pulp fantasies buried in our memories, and because it's done so brilliantly, it reactivates old thrills, fears, and exhilarations we thought we'd abandon when we read our last copy of Amazing Stories." The most fascinating single scene for me was the one set in the bizarre saloon on the planet of Tatooine. As that incredible collection of extraterrestrial alcoholics and bug-eyed martini drinkers lined up at the bar, and as Lucas so slyly let them exhibit characteristics that were universally human, I found myself feeling a combination of admiration and delight. Star Wars has placed me in the presence of really magical movie invention. Then you had sharper criticism from reviewer Pauline Kael from The New Yorker. She probably wrote this article while sitting in a fancy cafe on the Upper East Side. Star Wars is like getting a box of Cracker Jacks, which is all prizes. There's no breather in the picture, no lyricism. The only attempt at beauty is the double sunset. It's enjoyable on its own terms, but it's exhausting too. Like taking a pack of kids to the circus. An hour into it, children say that they're ready to see it again. That's because it's an assemblage of spare parts. It has no emotional grip. It's an epic without a dream. But it's probably the absence of wonder that accounts for the film's special, huge success. The excitement of those who call it the film of the year goes way past nostalgia to the feeling that now is time to return to childhood. And honestly, from a certain point of view, her criticism does ring true, but I think she's not really the target audience here, nor does she really understand the target audience, something that Roger Ebert does seem to understand. The reviews from the top critics on Rotten Tomato for Rebel Moon are really not all that different from the reviews that Ebert and Kael wrote for Star Wars. Albeit this new generation of critics have much larger egos, they don't seem to understand their role, what their profession truly is. This is why you see a lot of activism in politics and reviewing art, which is just so stupid. And also the gatekeeping. The gatekeeping is infuriating. But the sentiment is still the same. This movie, visually speaking, is awesome, but the plot and story are derivative, as are many of the elements that the film draws from. But again, let me remind you, Star Wars was also highly derivative when it came out. It drew from Eastern, Western religion and lore. George Lucas was heavily influenced by a wide array of media that came before him. Star Wars had evil emperors and cunning princesses just like Flash Gordon. R2-D2, C-3PO, and Kenobi have their own analogs in Akira Kurosawa's Hidden Fortress. The Battle of Yavin almost rips dialogue and cinematography directly from Dam Busters. Fritz Lang's Metropolis was definitely where C-3PO gets his design from, and so on. Now, one could argue that the remix of content that is Star Wars is just a lot tighter as a package. But even if I do watch Zack Snyder's director cut of Rebel Moon and it's just that much better, like the Justice League Snyder cut, the real problem that Rebel Moon suffers from is not Zack Snyder necessarily, but from timing. The analogy of the Paris Theater going from one of the premier venues in New York City to just an extravagant expense for Netflix to enter award shows is relevant here. I mean, the film industry has changed so drastically. Content is being created at an alarming rate now. I mean, Star Wars fans used to be starved of content. There was almost a quarter-century gap between the original trilogy and the prequels, and a decade between the prequels and the sequels. And now we get like 2-3 TV shows a year that in the old days would have been full-on feature films. And Star Wars fans are now even suffering from fatigue. The internet has also democratized the ability for people to share information, and now we're being exposed to almost everyone's opinion on stuff like Star Wars, and I don't necessarily think that's good. Actually, I think it's horrible. That's because most of us are very impressionable. Even if we think that we're independent-minded, we are social creatures. We care about what other people think, and ideas can be very contagious and intrusive. It could shape our view of the world. It can even lead us to take action in, unpredictable ways. Humans were never designed to interact with the entire world. We were designed to interact with our close-knit circles, with people we trust and see all the time. Our brains are fooled into thinking that the interactions we have with people on the internet are the same. But the truth is, the information we get from the internet, even stuff that I say, it's just not high quality interaction with human beings. I'm not actually there. I'm not here to talk to you face to face. I'm producing this for a large audience, and I try my best, but again, it's not like talking to someone face to face. And so oftentimes it can be really hard to judge where the information you're getting is coming from. The person that's giving you this information could be extremely malicious. They could be crazy. They could be just extremely negative and have a horrible view on the world. And it's not something you want to expose yourself to. But because of the way information is created, how it's produced with a camera, with editing, it can be really easy to hide the flaws in the individuals giving the information out to you. And bad information, anger, it can spread just like a contagion. And that affects everything. In Star Wars, it gets shows canceled. It turns fans against each other for the dumbest reasons. In the sciences, in medicine, it creates misinformation. It makes people scared. In politics, it pushes extreme points of view to the masses that can be deadly. Albert Einstein famously said, "I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones." This sentiment still rings true today, in my opinion, but I do believe that we're in the midst of World War III right now, and the first salvo is not, munitions being fired, it's actually information being weaponized. Now, I love looking at this river behind me, especially on a peaceful Christmas day. No ferries, no boats, There's not even any cars on the West Side Highway. And I think about my own life in the last 30 years and what life was like when I was born compared to today, and things objectively are a lot better now. It's the little things like the food, the entertainment, the video games, and the big things like the political state of the world, the economic state of the world. There's just more. There's more development. There's more people living healthier, better lives, more access to clean water, less disease. Now, I know it feels the opposite, right? A lot of people seem to be angrier now, more pessimistic about the future. But if you actually take a look at the statistics, you take a look at infant mortality rates, all these really impactful things, the world has completely gotten better. It's really our perception, the information that has changed. You know, it's so easy today for just any random person to come on to YouTube and just spout nonsense, and that really is contagious. It affects so many different minds, especially the older generations, including my generation. I think the newer generations are going to be better adapted. They're going to grow up with a phone in their hands. They're going to learn pretty early on that a lot of the stuff they see on their phones is just nonsense, and it's, you know, low quality information. And I hope, you know, going forward, the Star Wars community begins to really understand this, that like there are a lot of bad, negative opinions out there. There are entire channels that are devoted to just being angry and upset because of that's how the algorithm really works. And you have to understand that like these things create such negativity in the fandom that it actually hurts the creation process. And in a lot of ways, I think it could lead to the destruction of the very thing that we cherish, which is Star Wars. You know, there's a time when we never had Star Wars TV shows and movies. There were entire generations who didn't grow up with a Star Wars movie because they just were in that 25-year gap or 10-year gap. And now we have content every year. A lot of that content's not good, but we also have Andor, The Mandalorian. I mean, things are actually pretty good for the Star Wars universe now that I think about it. And I guess that's what's always driven my channel forward. It's not that I am blind towards bad things. There's a lot of things I don't like about Disney, but I think in this information kind of driven society we live in, we have to be very aware of the information we consume. Just like how careful we are about the food we consume. You know, it does ultimately affect us and change how we interact with the things we love. But anyway, guys, I hope you had a really Merry Christmas, and I do hope you had a Happy New Year. A lot of love and peace to you guys. I'll see you next time.